Media and royal commentators frame this as a major reputational crisis for the monarchy.
If you ever release that, Sophie, you'll bring down the entire monarchy. Queen Camilla's words sliced through the room, icy and razor-sharp. Behind the locked doors of Clarence House, a plot took shape, built on wealth, authority, and enforced silence. Sophie, once celebrated as the most impeccably proper woman in the British royal family, had accidentally uncovered Queen Elizabeth II's hidden will. One single sentence inside it overturned everything. From that instant on, Sophie was no longer simply the composed daughter-in-law. She became a target. Trapped and cut off within a network of influence, she resisted, calm on the surface, relentless underneath, following the trail of vanished documents, falsified signatures, and people who had once pledged loyalty but now answered only to the crown. When it seemed the truth was about to be swallowed whole by the shadows, an unexpected person reappeared carrying a cassette tape. Recorded on it was a shaking yet unmistakable voice. "Queen Camilla, she personally made me change it all. I was nothing but an instrument." That recording, combined with the authentic will, held the power to destroy Camilla's plan and clear Sophie's name. But in a world where dignity and dominance are inseparably linked, can justice truly win? Will Sophie stand as the last protector of the Queen's final wish? Or will she be ground down beneath the machinery of a royal politics? Windsor Castle, in the afternoon, always felt wrapped in a centuries-old stillness, worlds away from the noise and pageantry of Buckingham Palace. This was the place where Queen Elizabeth II had lived out her final years. And now the hallways and dim corners seemed saturated with her presence. A sovereign remembered for patience, resilience, and restraint. In a room devoted to the late Queen's personal belongings, where fading daylight slipped through Gothic panes and turned the settled dust to gold, Sophie, Countess of Wessex, Prince Edward's wife and the Queen's youngest daughter-in-law, remained behind. Her relationship with Elizabeth had long been known as unusually close, almost mother and daughter in its quiet tenderness, strengthened by trust shared out of public view. After 2000, as Sophie assumed more official duties, the Queen had given her responsibilities that very few were ever granted. She became one of the rare members of the family untouched by scandal, a standard-bearer of propriety. That closeness had tied her, without anyone noticing, not only to Elizabeth's legacy, but also to truths never intended to surface. Sophie stopped in front of a dulled brooch, a deep reverence rising in her chest. Nearby, museum staff carefully moved items from a large display case in preparation for a new exhibition. When they began easing an old oak cabinet away from the wall, Sophie's eyes caught on something that didn't belong, a small wooden box about the size of a diary, wedged behind one of the cabinet's legs as if it had been left there and forgotten. The heavy layer of dust suggested it had been untouched for years, and it clearly wasn't listed as part of the curated collection. She felt a strange, unexplainable urge to go closer. Motioning to the curator, she asked to inspect the neglected object before any cleaning continued. They set it on a table, dark ebony wood, heavier than its dimensions suggested, with a brass clasp turned green from age. The air around it seemed to insist on secrecy, and Sophie opened the latch silently. What she found wasn't jewelry or intimate correspondence. Inside rested a thin stack of parchment, folded with care. On top, the crimson seal of the British crown caught the light, and beneath it, written in ink that had faded but remained unmistakable were the words, "Secret Will of Elizabeth R." Sophie felt her blood drain, cold washing down her spine. The handwriting was the Queen's, refined and firm. Everything else in the room seemed to fall away. She began to read, and the ceremonial quiet of the chamber broke inside her like a storm. This document wasn't a simple record of possessions. It read like an admission. The Queen stated that Camilla, at the time Duchess of Cornwall, had exploited her standing to divert enormous sums from royal charities. The wrongdoing had taken place years before the Queen's health failed. Elizabeth explained that she had kept the matter hidden, aware that public exposure, right on the brink of succession, could fracture the nation's faith in the crown. Her silence had been a bitter offering, protecting the monarchy's dignity at the cost of her own sense of justice. The voice of the text carried grief, but also iron resolve, words left behind as a final declaration. And the last sentence, underlined twice, seared itself into Sophie's memory. "Whoever finds this truth, bring justice before the royal council. Do not let this shadow of greed tarnish the throne I guarded." Sophie, always loyal and careful, now stood at an unbearable crossroads. One direction meant preserving the palace's delicate calm, a peace sustained by the dead and their silence. The other meant honoring a plea filled with helplessness and a desperate longing for what was right. To follow it would require facing Camilla, now Queen, armed with authority and a spotless public image. It would be an uneven battle, and it could be seen as jeopardizing the stability King Charles was trying to secure. The exhibition room's door shut. The last trace of golden daylight vanished. Sophie rolled the parchment back into place, returned it to the box, and held it tightly in both hands. In the tomb-like quiet of Windsor, she understood with absolute clarity. From this moment forward, she had taken on the crown's most dangerous secret. She had entered a wordless contest of power, one where a single sentence could stain a dynasty beyond repair. The era of silence had ended, and the responsibility for justice now sat with a woman the world had always assumed was content to remain unseen. The secret will was kept out of sight beneath a false base inside a private safe at Bagshot Park. Edward and Sophie's home, sealed away from every public gaze. It was weight she could not share aloud, an obligation that had to remain unspoken. For Sophie, there was no time to lose. The search had to start immediately, but it also had to be carried out with total discretion, in keeping with the late Queen's way. For weeks, she requested permission to consult the Royal Charity Foundation's restricted financial files, framing it as a need to review management protocols post-transition, a believable rationale in the aftermath of the coronation. On the surface, the accounts looked clean. Major gifts from overseas benefactors, generous funding sent to humanitarian efforts. Yet the more closely she examined the details, the more inconsistencies began to emerge. Under the polished appearance of legitimate dealings, she found a recurring trail of strange, split-up transfers rooted toward shell entities incorporated in tax havens. Their titles were vague, and none of them connected to any genuine charitable mission. One company, Ocean Legacy Solutions, had been paid hundreds of thousands of pounds, listed under Rural Education Project Consulting. Using the practical experience and careful intuition she'd developed through years of public duty, Sophie tracked every amount. As the trail became clearer, a cold realization spread through her. Whoever had done this understood laundering far too well. To make sense of the payments, she turned to someone who should have answers, Lord Henry, Earl of Pembroke. Henry had been the Crown's top financial advisor across 3 reigns. With silver hair and an air of refined dependability, he embodied composed court professionalism. But when Sophie gently mentioned the need to clarify the charity's transaction history before Her late Majesty's passing, his expression tightened. For a brief moment, his calm slipped, and his normally steady eyes showed real alarm. He sidestepped her questions, insisting that too much time has passed, that those were decisions approved at the highest level, and then ended the discussion quickly. Henry's fear had a reason. Elsewhere, within Clarence's house, Queen Camilla sensed something changing, an almost imperceptible disruption moving through the palace atmosphere. Her political instincts were unforgivingly sharp. She still didn't know exactly what Sophie had discovered, but the Countess of Wessex's unusual attention to older financial records set off warning signals. Camilla called for Sir Thomas, her private secretary and a trusted confidant, a man known for loyalty that bordered on ice. In the soft flicker of candlelight inside her private sitting room, she delivered one light-sounding instruction that carried absolute force. Make sure every charity transaction record from 3 to 5 years ago is removed from the main access system. Replace them with fresh reports. Each pound must be clearly marked as donations to the Royal Children's Hospital and community schools. No holes, no missing pieces. It was carried out with brutal precision. Thousands of digital pages disappeared, and in their place appeared gleaming, new documentation. Printed on elegant paper, perfectly stamped, perfectly signed. The curtain fell thicker than before, and the farther Sophie pushed, the more alone she became. It wasn't just Henry. Other senior courtiers who might have known something also grew visibly uneasy. At a dinner, an experienced duke issued a blunt warning. "Countess, stop. After everything, the monarchy needs stability. Don't rake up the past, especially not where the charity is involved." Even among family, the mood hardened. Camilla, wearing her familiar expression of kindness, sometimes pinned Sophie with a look as cold and sharp as winter steel. Measuring, testing. No direct charge was made, yet suspicion threaded through the room all the same. Prince Edward noticed the strain and urged his wife to let things settle for the sake of peace. The isolation surrounded her like velvet, built from polite phrases, controlled smiles, and quiet pressure. Later that night, after another unproductive day, Sophie returned to Bagshot Park and sat in her study, turning over an impossible statement in her mind. A footman she trusted arrived with a slim envelope. No stamp, no return address, only a shaky handwritten message on the front. "If you want the truth, meet me in the old library at midnight." She knew the handwriting immediately, old-fashioned, slightly slanted. Lord Henry's, the tightness in her chest eased in an instant like a spark catching flame. The loyal financial advisor had decided that justice mattered more than safety. Sophie slid the letter into her sleeve, and in that moment, she understood she was no longer facing the crown entirely on her own, on her. The old library, an abandoned feeling wing used so rarely it might as well have been forgotten, held the smell of aging paper and dust, laid down over centuries. It was the ideal hiding place for a meeting that was never meant to happen. Wrapped in a dark wool cloak, Sophie moved through the corridors with deliberate care, placing each step as though the silence could crack if she disturbed it. Lord Henry was already there in the main reading room. He sat slumped in a worn, split-leather chair, his eyes fixed on a point that wasn't there. The refined court figure Sophie had always known seemed to have vanished. In his place was a hollowed-out man, consumed by something gnawing inside him. He had spent decades guarding the Crown's financial secrets, yet now he looked less like an advisor and more like someone waiting to be judged. Sophie lowered herself into the chair opposite him, without offering a greeting. She understood that what he needed first wasn't conversation, but space, silence, enough to finally let the truth come out. After a harsh, uneven breath, he began. His voice was rough with regret as he confessed that he had been the one who engineered the embezzlement. Henry explained that, in his role as financial advisor, he had arranged a chain of transactions on Camilla's behalf. Money intended for the royal charity had been rerouted through the shell companies Sophie had already traced, then washed clean through nominal sponsorship agreements tied to projects so vague they were barely real or didn't exist at all. He recounted it with unsettling precision, almost like a surgeon describing a procedure, a maze of documents and approvals so immaculate that even the sharpest auditors had reviewed it, shrugged, and signed off. At the beginning, he said, Camilla persuaded him it was meant to protect the monarchy from risky investments. But it didn't take long before the reality became undeniable. It was organized theft, repeated and methodical. His devotion to the crown had been bent into a weapon for private greed, and in doing so, he had sullied the pledge he had once made to the late queen. Eventually, the strain inside him reached its limit. During the most dangerous phase of the plan, Camilla had ensured she held leverage that could destroy him instantly, emails and signed memos that would place the blame entirely on his shoulders if anything ever surfaced. Sophie didn't offer sympathy. What she gave him was something harder: determination. There was no condemnation in her eyes, only a steady, wordless invitation to stand beside her. She set the small wooden box on the table, quiet proof of Elizabeth's will and the honor they both revered. The truth had to be brought into the open, not out of spite, but to lift the shadow staining the throne. The strength in her calm certainty settled something in him. No matter the consequences, helping Sophie was the only route left to earn redemption. But their meeting was destined not to last. As Henry left the library in haste, his steps weighted by what he had just admitted, Sir Thomas, Camilla's private secretary, was in the middle of a late-night security check. Thomas was obsessively vigilant. He missed nothing that looked out of place. He caught sight of Henry's outline moving past a corner, his face pale, his manner furtive. Nothing like a royal financial advisor should appear. Thomas didn't pause to think. His instincts snapped into action. The same man who had become uneasy when Sophie asked questions was now creeping through an empty wing at midnight. Within minutes, Camilla received a message. Henry left the old library at midnight 35. Traitor in our midst. At Clarence's house, Camilla was still awake. She stood by a tall window, watching the garden swallowed in darkness. Her phone vibrated. She read the text, and her expression didn't shift. No shock, no anger. Her eyes, cold as steel, seemed to cut through the night toward ancient Windsor itself, as if stone walls could not hide Henry from her. In her world, loyalty was never sacred, only useful. Once it failed, it became rubble to remove. Now she understood. The first true confrontation was approaching, and she finally knew the face of the opponent standing against her. The instant Sir Thomas's message reached Queen Camilla, she understood that protecting secrecy was no longer the main objective. The approach shifted sharply. Instead of hiding the truth, she would make it meaningless. Her answer would be a public performance so brilliant it would smother suspicion. Within days, Clarence House transformed into the command center for a media event unlike anything seen before. A lavish charity gala was arranged, drawing in celebrities, wealthy magnates, and, most importantly, an entire army of journalists. Camilla appeared luminous, her smile gentle, and her expression sincere as she presented newly issued financial reports. Sir Thomas's polished, carefully assembled dossiers were placed directly into reporters' hands. Every number pointed neatly toward aid campaigns, hospitals and schools, scrubbing away every hint of the earlier questionable transfers. The press reaction came fast and loud. Britain's media, already captivated by Camilla in her new position, celebrated her as the compassionate queen, praising her supposed devotion to openness and accountability. Against that wave of approval, Sophie, Countess of Wessex, was pushed into the role of palace outcast. Pressure closed in around her, subtle yet suffocating. Other royals, seeing only the immaculate reports, began looking at her with confusion. Quiet rumors framed her as too sensitive over long-ago finances, even as disrespectful of hierarchy for insisting on reopening the past. Even Prince Edward, worn down by the unspoken conflict, pleaded with her in private to let it go. Keeping the monarchy steady, he argued, mattered more than proving a buried secret. Sophie's solitude only grew heavier. Then came the second strike, this time aimed at Lord Henry. Camilla called him to Clarence House. The conversation played out in an eerie calm. She never referred to the midnight meeting in the library, and she didn't voice any direct threat. Instead, she spoke of his many years of devotion, his diligent service to the late Queen, and then, almost tenderly, mentioned how quickly a respected reputation could collapse under unnecessary conflict. She didn't need to say anything else. The stillness in her measured, penetrating stare carried the warning on its own. Henry understood immediately that she knew everything. The weight of her authority bore down on him. His name and his future were balanced in her hands. Fear swallowed what conscience remained. His admission to Sophie had become a dangerous error. He left the palace and then vanished from Sophie's reach, ignoring her calls. His phone went silent. Meetings were suddenly unavailable. From Sophie's perspective, the sting was unmistakable. Henry had switched sides, purchased, shattered, or both, and justice had been left behind. One by one, every route closed. Sitting alone in her study at Bagshot Park, Sophie stared at the Queen's handwritten will lying on her desk. Outside, the glow from the gala still colored London's night sky, a sign of Camilla's momentary victory. Sophie understood then that the road ahead would be more solitary than ever. This had stopped being a struggle against a single woman. It was now a battle against an entire fortress of influence and public perception. And she would have to find proof so undeniable it could not be contained by the Queen's reach. On her own. After Queen Camilla's crushing counterattack, Bagshot Park turned into Sophie's private stronghold. Lord Henry's betrayal, no matter how much pressure lay behind it, only honed her determination until it felt sharp enough to cut. Inside the palace, trust was no longer an option. If justice was going to happen, It would rest entirely on Sophie's own endurance and clarity of mind. If the digital trail had been wiped clean and replacement reports had been staged with such precision, then the real story could only be hiding where time left things untouched. Sophie shifted her focus to the Royal Archives, rarely visited vaults thick with dust, packed with aging contracts and brittle ledgers. For days on end, she worked in freezing underground rooms, inhaling damp, moldy air while combing through mountains of pages that led nowhere. Then, in a wrongly filed bundle marked Post-2005 Estate Inheritances, she spotted a financial folder flagged in blue that clearly didn't fit. Inside was a worn contract, its edges frayed, tied to a fraudulent property arrangement. What mattered most was this. It was an agreement between the Royal Charity Foundation and one of the offshore shell companies she had already identified. And at the bottom, beside Lord Henry's authorizing signature, sat Camilla's full, unmistakable signature as well. Evidence Sophie had missed before, or assumed, had been swallowed in the paper labyrinth. This was the first direct connection she'd found, beyond Henry's earlier claim that he'd only acted under implicit direction. At the same time, far from the palace in a secluded country manor, Lord Henry was unraveling. Camilla's cold, unblinking gaze had locked fear into his bones, pushing him to retreat from Sophie and cut off contact. But guilt kept growing louder than dread. He couldn't live with betraying justice a second time. Taking extreme care, he opened his desk and retrieved a tiny digital recorder he had concealed there. In the depths of the night, he recorded a complete and painstaking confession. His voice shook at the start, then gradually steadied as he continued. He laid out every financial step in detail and stated without ambiguity that Camilla had ordered the diversion of funds and that he had only carried it out, trapped by unquestioning loyalty and threats that were never spoken outright. He included dates, places, and circumstances. This wasn't just regret, it was a formal declaration meant to stand like testimony, drawn from the deepest part of his remorse. Realizing there could be no return once he acted, Henry transferred the recording onto a micro-cassette or memory card, and, using a servant he trusted, someone whose family he had helped in the past, sent an unmarked package to Bagshot Park. The message inside was brief: for atonement. Camilla, always sensitive to shifts in the balance of power, noticed Henry's unnatural quiet after their encounter. She understood fear well, but she also understood the old-fashioned code he still carried. Worried he might do something desperate, she instructed Sir Thomas to comb through Henry's former office materials and to keep Sophie under constant watch. The parcel arrived for Sophie on an afternoon battered by rain. She listened to it immediately. In her empty study, Henry's exhausted yet controlled voice echoed through the room. Cold ran through her as he methodically broke down the finances. Then that chill faded into clarity when he delivered the decisive statement. Queen Camilla personally directed the redirection of funds, followed by specific dates and project names. There was no way to dismiss it. Not gossip, not altered paperwork. A first-hand confession, reinforced by the signed contract. Sophie was no longer merely a countess standing alone. She now possessed the most dangerous, most explosive leverage in the monarchy. She secured the tape, the contract, and Elizabeth's secret will inside her personal safe. When the heavy steel door slammed shut, she straightened. The calm she usually wore like armor was now lit with unwavering force. The time to act had arrived, and this time no sparkling gala would be able to soften or divert the strike she was ready to deliver. A special sitting of the Royal Council was called and held under total secrecy in a small, austere chamber within Buckingham Palace. This was the place where the monarchy's most severe and most confidential decisions were made, sealed away from the public and beyond the reach of the press. Tension saturated the room, so dense it felt as if the air itself had thickened into something heavy and unmoving. King Charles presided from the head of the room, his expression marked by fatigue and long contemplation. Seated around him were the Crown's leading legal advisors, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and a select number of senior royals. Queen Camilla faced them, her composure disturbingly unbroken. She wore a refined cream-colored suit, her hair pinned back with care, and her eyes remained fixed on Sophie, who sat beside a narrow stack of documents. When the appointed moment arrived, Sophie stood. She did not rely on dramatic speech or ornamented language. She needed only the facts. She opened with Queen Elizabeth II's secret will. As the pages were handed along the table, the room fell completely silent. Advisors studied the seal and handwriting with painstaking care. Its legitimacy was beyond challenge. The late Queen's painful admission that she had concealed embezzlement to protect the Crown's reputation struck the Council like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't simply proof, but an ethical condemnation. After that, Sophie produced the worn financial contract. She indicated the signature at the bottom, Camilla's own, linking the agreement to a shell company Sophie had already traced. Unlike polished charity dossiers, this was tangible evidence that could not be erased by public-facing paperwork. As the pressure tightened, Camilla remained eerily composed. In a controlled, gentle tone, she dismissed it as an administrative misunderstanding, suggesting the documents had been misrepresented or that she had signed quickly without understanding the deeper financial context. Then she turned her eyes to the king with a pleading look, implying that the entire matter was an attempt to undermine the throne itself. The tension reached its height when Sophie revealed there was an audio recording. The chamber went still as Lord Henry's exhausted yet unmistakable voice poured from the device placed at the center of the table. He not only confessed to his role, but stated clearly, Queen Camilla personally ordered the diversion of funds. I acted under threat to my reputation. Justice belongs to the late Queen. When the recording ended, the door opened again. Lord Henry, having sent the tape, and knowing there was no point in hiding, entered the room. He appeared depleted, yet there was a calm steadiness in his eyes. Standing before the council, he confirmed every point Sophie had raised and declared himself prepared to face whatever legal punishment followed. His presence and direct testimony delivered the final, crushing blow to Camilla's defense. Camilla searched the room, her gaze ultimately turning to King Charles, her husband, her consort, the man who had endured decades of turmoil at her side. But Charles said nothing. He had taken in each piece of evidence, felt the force of his mother's final wish, and heard Henry's confession. The king's silence spoke as a verdict. The atmosphere in the chamber became suffocating. Under Charles's authority, the council proceeded to a vote. After a short but solemn deliberation, a senior legal advisor stood and read the decision aloud. The statement cited undeniable proof of violated trust, misuse of authority, and the embezzlement of charitable funds. Camilla was formally deprived of the title of queen forbidden from using it, and stripped of every privilege attached to it. She was instructed to leave the palace immediately and to relinquish all assets obtained from or connected to royal money. Camilla did not speak. Her face remained controlled to the end, yet behind her eyes, the collapse of a carefully built empire of ambition could be seen. She rose, gave the king a reluctant bow, and walked from the chamber at a measured pace. The door shut behind her without noise. No one followed her with their eyes. The space she left behind looked stark, cold, and hollow. In the hidden corridors of power, justice had finally been delivered. In the aftermath of the harrowing council hearing at Buckingham Palace, an uncanny stillness settled across the royal residences. Camilla's removal from the Queen's title was carried out without spectacle. No ceremonies, no expansive public explanation beyond the council's sealed records. The monarchy relied on its oldest instinct, discretion, drawing a heavy velvet curtain over the rupture to protect the crown's enduring dignity. Lord Henry, once the crown's unwavering financial guardian, was quietly allowed to retire into isolation. He withdrew from London to the countryside, far from scrutiny and political pressure. Though he did not escape the personal cost of his past actions, the truth he ultimately delivered was acknowledged and respected. Sophie, by contrast, became a silent symbol within palace walls. She neither sought recognition nor offered comment. No interviews, no formal statements, no public acknowledgement. To those who understood what had truly occurred, she was the protector of Queen Elizabeth's honor and final intent, the woman who had dared to confront concealed authority in the name of justice. Yet Sophie answered every unspoken commendation with restraint. She knew that justice in royal life required no celebration. It moved quietly, like a hidden current restoring clarity beneath the surface. Gradually, equilibrium returned. One late afternoon at Windsor Castle, Sophie returned to the relic gallery where everything had begun. She wished to personally organize the storage, an intimate gesture of closure. The staff had rearranged the artifacts, and the small wooden box was no longer concealed, now resting plainly on a modest plinth. She stepped closer. When she gently opened the lid, the vessel that had carried the crisis, she found the true will was gone, already surrendered to the council. Yet the box itself remained. As her fingers traced the worn velvet lining, she sensed its emptiness, until her touch caught on a slight fold she had never noticed before. Lifting the lining, she uncovered a small slip of paper, written in Queen Elizabeth's unsteady hand from her final years. It read, "Truth needs no eternal defender, only a heart brave enough to hold it." There was no order, no demand for action, only quiet, enduring wisdom. The Queen had not asked anyone to wage battles on her behalf, only to preserve truth with courage. Sophie understood then that she had not simply followed instructions. She had answered an act of profound trust placed in her by a remarkable woman. Justice was not confined to a single verdict. It lived in the ongoing resolve to act with integrity. She carefully returned the note, smoothed the velvet back into place, and closed the lid. Leaving the box behind in the gentle dusk, she walked away. Beyond the gallery, the late sunlight poured through tall windows and illuminated the stern portrait of Queen Elizabeth II on the wall. It was more than a likeness. It stood as a lasting symbol of quiet justice and unwavering royal honor. Sophie continued onward, knowing that no matter how intricate or suffocating power might become, justice could still prevail behind velvet curtains, safeguarded by one courageous heart. After finishing the story, what do you think was Sophie's greatest motivation for overcoming isolation and threats to pursue justice? And do you believe this motivation is realistic in the context of royal power? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.